and the extent to which, of course, these also must be counted amongst the indigenous knowledge resources. And of course, the whole idea of, again, preservation must be applied in this context. Well, I thought talking about written texts might be superfluous at this point, and I think I was right. I think we've gone through a lot in terms of that. And so the second part of the paper, actually, of my discussion, I don't know how much time I have, also focuses on, more specifically, on certain segments of certain aspects of the intellectual resources that we have, the knowledge systems. And I broke this down into agronomy, food processing, chemistry, and traditional medical practice. I know one of the presenters from Senegal talked a bit about traditional medical practice. The fact is that, of course, the various segments mentioned here would also be reflected in written information. And we have the manuscripts of different types. Sometimes we have to weed through very closely in order to get relevant information. But they also are reflected in the material artifacts that we have, in the rock art that we come across. And so we have to think in a very multidimensional way. In terms of agronomy, food processing, and chemistry, obviously we're dealing with a great deal of initiative in the various city-states, kingdoms, and empires, since Africans domesticated, cultivated, harvested fruits, legumes, vegetables, etc. And sorghum, of course, which shows up all over the continent, would be reflected. And by the way, would in the long run be disseminated. The use of sorghum would be, put it this way, imported by other continents. And of course, in some of the rock art, we do really have illustrations of different plants and animals, flora and fauna. And that's another thing which we have to note, that when looking at rock art, for example, should also be done in such a way that we recognize the ability of whoever did this work to observe the environment and to document this. And therefore, it is very much part of our information, if you want, which would be linked to botany and also agronomy, etc., as we try to recapture the history of our continent. The grape seeds, barley, oats, lentils, and so on, dated to about 300 BCE. In the case of Ethiopia, should be noted. We have those very famous rice fadamas in Sokoto and in the inland Niger Delta, etc. So the whole thing here is that we have some basic information, but I think as we comb through the various kinds of manuscripts or various kinds of illustrations, we add to the knowledge that we have. Variety of plants, of course, some of which are now popular in Asia, of course, would come from Africa. But you wouldn't see it in the textbooks. You know, they downplay that. And we are the ones, we have to emphasize this. It might seem ordinary to us, but really, you pick up the average textbook, it's not there. I can remember going through some world civilization textbooks. You look at the map of Africa, you look at the map of the world, as a matter of fact, and you would see, you know, okay, maize and cassava, this and that from the Americas. They would put stuff for the Mesopotamia and so on. And then they, you know, might just throw in about 2 plants in the African context. And I have complained to some of these textbook publishers, and you know, about this. But we also have to be aware of the information. Because after all, domestication of plants would also imply organized thought, logical thinking, and I think in a sense we've got to link this to the whole history of science and scientific thinking. Logical thinking in the context of the continent. And of course, even in the context of agronomy and applications, you have to understand soil texture, you have to understand the process of seed fertilization, weather patterns, and so on. And therefore, this in itself would mean that scientific thinking, understanding one's environment, must be known. And of course, the food processing, which I think is underestimated by many scholars, food processing in itself would involve hypothesis formulation. You have to have some kind of basic thesis here about what's in your head as you proceed. You have to have some kind of assumption of some kind of pattern in nature. That if I do this today and I do it tomorrow and I do it the day after, this or that may happen. So there's some kind of logical and predictive capability on the part of the food processor. And some measure of trial and error experimentation would be there as well. And generally, when you put all of this together, you're beginning to see, and we saw in the ancient period and evolving to the contemporary, the applications of carefully, of intellectual work in the context of a more pragmatic purpose. Okagboe, who has done a lot of work on, or has done some work in the field of microbiology, would point out, for example, that food processors would use certain metallic objects to hasten fermentation, and which is a very scientific thing to do. And by doing so, and of course, as we would see in the context of chemistry, certain applications would also be attested to and by the laboratory analysts as being pretty rational in terms of achieving their ends. I actually came across Dr. Zarua in a conference in Nigeria. At that point in time, he hadn't done work on chemistry, but he introduced himself as a chemist. And I said, but wait a minute, why don't you, do something here, help us out. Use your knowledge as a chemist and evaluate some of the traditional beverages and traditional products and, let us know. And he agreed to do that, actually. Well, I gave him some private funding, but that was really just nothing. I mean, he really got, interested in the project. And he came out with a very interesting paper, a write-up, really, which is now produced in Africa Update and probably in some more later on, text, etc. The important thing is that not many people looked at chemistry, the chemistry behind the beverages, or the chemistry behind distillation, whether alcoholic beverages or whatnot. And his work proved quite a lot of science being reflected here. He had practitioners, construct the usual steamer pot placed below another vessel. And in the long run, we see, according to him, that many of their active actions, many of the actions of the practitioners, the traditional practitioners, would be scientifically proven to be correct. And they would set in train certain processes which we would find very sound.
Professor Megwali?
So let me go to...
Professor Megwali,
yeah.
we will be thrown out of this place, you know,
No,
security.
no, just tell me how many minutes. 1 minute,
Yeah,
2 or 3?
No, you have 1, please.
Okay.
Thank
So
you.
the 1 minute, I would just say that social reconstruction would continue, would necessarily have to continue the decolonization process. Secondly, challenge domination. Thirdly, reject the old neoconservative triumphalism. Aim for equity, fairness, and equal access, and tap into indigenous knowledge systems. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.